Hello, welcome to Nailing It Down, a program here at Vulgar, and we're continuing our series that has been on hiatus for a little while on the critique of the Gotha program. I'm going to talk about that hiatus before we go into the text today. Originally, this was something I was doing between myself and Jordin Dubin. And occasionally interfacing with Nico via Real because we'd had private conversations with it based off of some debates around, labor as a source of all value, which I think is not true, according to Marx. And I think it's not true also in fact. But that there is a lot of ambiguity in what the text says because there's these dialectical turnarounds in it that you have to go on. And then I started thinking and realizing that I needed to talk about the hermeneutic tradition around the critique of the Gotha program in the first place, because there are people like Lars Lee who think we put too much importance on it. There's people like Peter Hudis and Kevin Anderson who think we don't put enough emphasis on it. There are people like Carlos Garrido and Domenico Lacerdo who think that it justifies your kind of productive development after the revolution. And the reason why it became so important is that it's a huge portion of the argument in State and Revolution by Lenin is actually based off of reading a critique of the Gotha program. So a whole lot of justifications of different people's politics come from this, like in the dialogue with Stalin, Amigo Bardiga makes a big deal out of the stages from the critique of the Gotha program. He modifies them depending on the time period, but they're there. There's a lot made out by Paul Burkett about natural wealth versus, in both use values and as unvalorized capital versus valorized capital and abstract value. All these things, make this text super important, and yet we also have to deal with the fact that it was not really, as Lars Lee pointed out, meant to be read as a finished text. I went into the letters with Jordin Dubin in episode 2 of this series, and we talked about what the letters say. Both the letter from Marx to Braca and the letters from Engels to Babel. Now we're going to go into the text. I'm using 2 versions today, and I'm going to admit that Jordin Dubin helped me create some notes for some things to talk about today. So I'm still giving Jordin kind of honorary co-host credit for this, even though she's not here with us for the foreseeable future. So we're going to get into the text right now and kind of talk about it. And I'm going to try to do what I did last time and keep the text more or less on the page so you can see it. So we are in subheading 2, which is the second plank. All right. This is what's in the text. This is from the Gotha program itself. In present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the capitalist classes. The resulting dependence of the working class is the cause of misery and servitude in all forms. All right, now here's what the general rule of the International Working Men's Association says from 1864. And this is important because, as Marx says here, this sentence borrowed from the rules of the International is incorrect in its approved edition. So here's what the rules of the International say. That the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working classes themselves. That the struggle for the emancipation of the working class must not be a struggle for class privileges or monopolies, but of equal rights and duties, and the abolition of all class rule. That the economical subjugation of man of labor to the monopolizers of the means of labor, that is, to the sources of life, lies at the bottom of the servitude and all its form of all social misery, mental degradation, and political dependence. Now, I don't have to point out to you that that's a much broader statement than what is being said by the Gotha critique, by the Gotha program here. So let's go into Marx, what Marx has to say to this. In present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of landowners. The monopoly of the property and land is even the basis of the monopoly of capital. Now, this is important, all right? For a lot of people critique Marx for not understanding how important land is to capital property relations, and that rentier relations actually precedes capitalist relations, right? Even in capitalism. And Marx makes a hay of this in a lot of his political and economic manuscripts to good effect. But it's clear that he actually thinks that the first form of property ownership is the claim to the title of land. All right, go back up. In the passage in question, the rules of the International do not mention either one or the other of the monopolists. They speak of the monopolizers of the means of labor, that is, the sources of life. The addition, the sources of life, makes it sufficiently clear that land is included in the instruments of labor. The correction was introduced because Lassalle, for reasons now generally known, attacked only the capitalist class and not the landowners. In England, the capitalist class is usually not even the owner of the land on which the factory stands. And that's still true. It's technically often owned by feudal lords. So in this sense, the landowner, which is the basis for what we might call feudal relations, and that's a broad term, and there's problems with that historiographic term, but Marx accepts it, comes from land ownership first, and that's even true in capitalist relations. And the reason why they don't talk about capital specifically is Marx is like, no, like monopolizers of the means of life do not always have to be the monopolizers of, like, say, the productive forces. They could be monopolizers of land or food or whatever, monopolizers of agriculture, monopolizers of the use of force. That causes subjugation. What Lassalle does is apply this only to the capitalist class and not to other oppressing classes for reasons of a class alliance, is what Marx is implying there. And makes it seem like the only issue is capitalist relations, which there are a lot of Marxists who seem to think that too. So I get why Marx is insisting on this. All right, next part here. All right. Now, one thing we can ask is, does Marx's edition of the sources of life actually clarify this enough that it wouldn't lead to a Lassallean misreading? And I can tell you that Jordin really isn't sure. All right. She also asks in her notes, what is the reason that Lassalle is only attacking the capitalist class? And that is because Lassalle thinks he can form an alliance with the aristocratic classes, which are the prior landowning classes, not just landlords, titled aristocracy, to fight against the bourgeoisie. And that turned out to be true. That wasn't just a rumor. All right. Subsection of section 1.3, which is another section of the Gotha program. The emancipation of labor demands the promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property of society and the cooperative regulation of total labor with a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. This is Marx's commentary. The promotion of the instruments of labor to common property ought obvious to read conversion into common property. But this is only passing. So he's like, well, yeah, this is like a stylistic problem. What are the proceeds of labor? The products of labor are its value. In the latter case, the total value of the product are only that part of the value which labor has newly added to the value of the means of production consumed. Now, that question is an interesting question. All right. So the proceeds of labor could be the actual use value products that we might use, or it could be the abstract value distributed back. And that's actually a different thing for Marx. All right. The proceeds of labor is a loose notion which Lassalle has put in the place of a definite economic conception. What is a fair distribution? And this part's important for different reasons. Do not the bourgeoisie assert that the present day distribution is fair? And is it not, in fact, the only fair distribution on the basis of the present mode of production? Or economic relations regulated by legal conceptions do not, on the contrary, the legal relations arise out of the economic ones? This is actually a really important question because it's the difference between MMTers and Marxists. And other kinds of chartalist and legal forms of money questions. So, for example, if you think that legal conceptions create the economic ones, then it's a problem of law to fix. Whereas if you think the economic ones actually precede the legal ones, it's a much broader social problem. So where you think the problem is going to have real implications. And Marx is basically saying, socialists have always thought that basically the economic arrangements precede the legal ones and they are codified in law. Sometimes Marxists will talk about this as a feedback cycle, the base and the superstructure, because relations of productions are part of the base. And are relations of production determined by law, or does law reflect the already existing relations of production? That's actually a hard question to answer, even empirically. Marx has staked a lot on the answer being the relations of production which create the mode precede legal apparatuses. The legal apparatuses come after the fact, not before. It's very hard for me to actually argue that that's always true. All right. But in a kind of empirical sense, it's also very hard to me to argue that it isn't true in an empirical sense. We don't always have the information to make that clear. So let's go back to the text here, but just understanding what's at stake. To understand what is implied in this connection by the phrase fair distribution, we must take the first paragraph and this one together. The latter presupposes a society wherein the instruments of labor are common property and that the total labor is cooperatively regulated. And from the first paragraph, we learn that, quote, the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. To all members of society? To those who do not work as well? What remains of the undiminished proceeds of labor? Only to those members of society who work? What remains then of the equal right of all members of society? So you got a problem there, right? Marx is pointing out that there is a problem here. If you limit it only to those who work, that's, fair. But how do you deal with everybody else in society? If everybody has an equal right to all members of society, are you assuming that everybody can work and work the same way? And Marx says, but all members of society in equal right are obviously mere phrases. The kernel consists in this, that in this communist society, every worker must receive the undiminished Lassallean proceeds of labor. First, let us take, first of all, the words proceeds of labor. In the sense that the product of labor, then the cooperative proceeds of labor are the total social product. Okay. Now, how do you measure this? Marx is not entirely clear how you measure the total social product, but we'll come back to that later. From this must now be deducted. First, the replacement of the means of production. So you got to take stuff out to replace what you use to produce the work and keep up with the machines, deal with all fixed forms of the capital, etc. Second, an additional portion for the expansion of the production. So you got to invest. Third, the reserve or insurance fund to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities. These deductions from the undiminished proceeds of labor are an economic necessity, and their magnitude is to be determined according to available means and forces, and partly by computation of probabilities. but they are in no way calculable by equity, meaning you can't figure this out just because things have to be equal. There remains another part of the total product intended to serve as means of consumption. Before this is divided amongst the individuals, there has to be deducted again from it. First, the general cost of administration not belonging to production. How do you, what, this is the covering of things that are socially necessary, but don't lead to commodities. This part will, from the onset, be very considerably restricted in comparison to present day society, because you don't need to make those people rich. And that's me adding that. And it diminishes in proportion as new society develop. It's going to be cost a lot less overhead for this stuff as things are developed and you do reinvest. Second, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs such as school, health services, etc. So we have to deal with other social necessities such as school, health services, stuff that keep the social reproduction of society going. Right? That's got to come out of people's labor. There's no way around it. You can't get it undiminished from your work. From the onset, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops. Third, funds for those unable to work, etc., in short, for what is included under the so-called poor relief today. And by this, Marx means like we have to take care of the disabled, the elderly, the young who cannot contribute to labor. That they have value in society, and we're not going to just let them die. And if we took the first part of Lassalle's undiminished proceeds go to those who make it, then we're going to let those people die. I mean, that's what Marx is saying, and we can't do that. Like, Marx is not this much of an ableist as he's often accused of being. Now, he's also not saying, however, that people who get taken up by this and protected by general means society get the same things as people who work, and we'll come back to that. At least not in the early stages, but we'll talk about that later. Only now have we come to the distribution, which the program under the Lassallean influence alone has in its narrow fashion, namely to say that it is part of the means of consumption which is divided amongst the individual producers of a cooperative society. This undiminished proceeds of labor has already unnoticeably become converted into diminished proceeds, although what the producer is deprived in his capacity as a private individual benefits him directly or indirectly in his capacity as a member of society, meaning that there is such a thing in a communist society as social investment. We're keeping your relatives and loved ones alive who can't work. You might be in that situation, and we made provisions for you. We have paid for the administrative overhead, and by paid here, I don't want people to think we mean in cash, because that's not how this works. We mean actually those people receive the proceeds of labor and commodity making as they need to live to do these things. And you also have to use the resources, not the cash. Don't think about this in cash form in this kind of society, but you have to have the resources to provision the society at large. Like, Marx isn't wrong here. You can't just give people exactly what they put in and everything still work. Marx actually does realize that, and he also realizes the free rider problem, and we'll get to that in a minute. Just as the phrase undiminished precedes labor has disappeared, so now does the proceeds of labor disappear. We need those two phrases that are important to the Lassallean program, according to Marx. Within the cooperative society based on the common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their product. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as the material quality possessed by them. Since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. The phrase proceeds of labor, objectionable also today as an account of its ambiguity, thus loses all meaning. Now let's talk about what Marx means here. Within a cooperative society based on the common ownership of the means of production, communism, the producers do not exchange their products. We don't need people exchanging products on the market just to do it. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as value of these products as the material quality possessed by them. We're only measuring labor here so we can make this stuff. Since now, in contrast to the capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor, meaning that individual labor isn't something you get paid for as a wage exactly, and thus as an individual thing of labor power that you sell on the market. The phrase proceeds of labor, objectionable also today on account of its ambiguity, thus loses all meaning in a communist society. That's what Marx is implying. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but contrary as it emerges from a capitalist society. Now, a whole lot rides on this argument, guys. This is where a whole lot of debates around what Marx means really comes out, and we'll get to here. This is the other big sticky wiki in this document. Which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whom its womb emerges. Marx does not think of a new society emerging as a totally clean break, and he makes that very clear. Just like he doesn't think capitalism loses all of its aristocratic function beforehand. Now, this actually makes a lot of, say, left communist positions sort of difficult to maintain, just like it also, I think, is going to hit people who think all you need to do is develop the productive forces, because Marx is going to kind of imply that that's not enough either. Sorry, Dungist. Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. All right, so here he's saying we're not going to have a totally equal society in terms of what you get back. What he has given to it in his individual quantum of labor, this means just a little part about it. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of individual hours of work. The individual hour of labor of that individual producer is part of the social working day contributed by him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society. This is where labor tokens come from, people. That he has furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducting his labor from the common funds, which are all the costs mentioned above. And with this certificate, he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he receives back in another. So in a communist society, in the early phases of a communist society, which we might call the lower phases of socialism, Marx uses the word somewhat interchangeably here. The same amount of labor which is given to society in one form, he receives back in another. So we haven't got to where everyone's just going to get paid equally on everything. But we also don't have any concept of added value here, right? You're not getting added value for doing work. You're getting your labor hours back in product. After you make sure that everyone has a minimum to live, that schooling and healthcare is provided, etc. Now, if this sounds very different than what you think socialism is going to be, it's because you haven't really got the text. Now, Marx doesn't think this is a forever thing, though, and we'll get to that later, right? Like, Marx is just saying this is how it's got to start. It can't completely break from capitalism. But you'll notice here, he isn't saying that we still have, like, money in markets, because these labor tokens for hourly compensation are standardized. They're not fungible the way that money is. And by that I mean you can't trade them for something else. Like you're putting in hours of common stock for hours of common stock, rationalized off of probably an average of the labor that it takes to make a thing. You're getting that average back in a labor token, which you can use to get what you want. Now you'll notice that this also doesn't really lead to like social rationing. All right. Here, obviously, the same principle prevails as regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as equal exchange of values. Right. Right. So he's saying this is still kind of a capitalist way of looking at things, but we have to do this. Content inform or change. Marx makes a big deal out of this in other places, that like why you're doing something changes what it does. He talks about this in terms of usury under like aristocratic and feudal societies versus what it does in capital, which is uh it, which in both cases they function to enrich power, but they enrich power differently. Even though the essential form are change. But because under altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor. Meaning that you can't own the means of production, so there's no way to really get more ahead other than your labor to labor change. So you can work harder and get more stuff from the common stock. You would have an incentive to work. So when people who say that communist society, for example, does not create incentives to work, they're incorrect. It's only about incentives to work in the early phases. All right. And yes, we're going to make sure that people don't starve if they can't work. And we're going to make sure that people have houses over their heads and those kind of social goods. We're going to make sure they have health care. You know, Marx says that's for everybody, but everybody who can work better work. And because, on this other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except the means of consumption. Meaning that there's no way to like save this and buy capital. All you can do is buy stuff that you would consume or you would want. Right. So you can't use this to like further invest in your business. It's going to be done by society at large. But as far as the distribution of the latter among the individual producers is concerned, the same principle prevails in the exchange of commodity equivalents. Given the amount of labor in one form is exchanged for the amount of labor in another form. Here, hence, equal right here is still in principle a bourgeois right. Although the principle and practice are no longer at loggerheads, while the exchange of equivalents in the commodity exchanges exist only on the average and not in the individual cases. So we're not using like markets to kind of mess with price indicators to get this around. To get around this, we're using the average labor time that it takes to make something in exchange for a certificate of the average labor time you put in, whatever you did, to get that back after we deduct for everything else in society. And remember, we're not taking money, we're taking direct resources. So we make sure that there are schools and the teachers are provisioned. We make sure there's healthcare and the doctors are provisioned, etc. And interestingly, the only communist society that I know of that actually tried this, like spelled out here, was rural societies, and Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution really did try this. And they had like, also you had labor exchanges, you do different types of labor. So they really tried to implement this. People will use this to say that like lots of capitalism is still okay under, like, you can have capitalist development under Marxian things because it's for the common good. It's pretty clear, and this is the part of the section that people use to justify that. But it's pretty clear that's not what Marx is talking about here. He's not talking about anything that you can exchange on a market for higher value. All right. So the reason why this exchange of equivalents is only on average and not in the individual cases is because you're not trying to, according to this, you're not in a market where you can like try to get ahead on somebody, since all this is kind of standardized. That's one of the things that Marx thinks has to happen in the beginnings of communism. All right. Now, again, this is one of the only texts we have where Marx spells out what he thinks communism is. So it's really kind of important to get what he's talking about here. But he's also saying this still acts like bourgeois society. All right. because we still haven't got to each from their own, each according to their own ability to each according to their own need. We're actually still at each according to the amount they work is what they get back from work. Right. In spite of this advance, the equal right is still constantly stigmatized by bourgeois limitation. The right of producer is proportional to the labor they supply. The equality consists in the fact that the measurement is made an equal standard, a measurement of labor. All right. But one man is superior to another physically or mentally, or supplies more labor in the same time, or can labor for a longer time, or labor to serve as a measure must be defined by its duration or intensity. Otherwise, it ceases to be a standard of measurement. So it's an equal right to an unequal right for unequal labor. All right, so we're still at the level of in this early stage of development is you have your equal right is you're going to get paid the same amount regardless, because it's going to be standardized across society. That's all he's promising. If you but you don't have an equal right for unequal labor, so like you're still going to get paid like in a standardized hour exchange. It recognizes no class differences, so there's no raises for added value people who think that's in here. But because everyone is only a worker like everyone else. But it tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment and thus productive capacity as a natural privilege. It is therefore a right of inequity in its content like every right, meaning that there's no such thing as equal rights. Right, by its very nature, can only exist in application of an equal standard, but unequal individuals, and they would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, are measurable only by equal standard insofar that they are brought under the equal point of view, are taken from one another definite side only, for instance, in the present case are regarded only as workers, and nothing more seen in them, everything else being ignored. This is why there's no added value in communism, people. And this is also why he's not talking about just market socialism. For instance, in the present case, are regarded only as workers and nothing more is seen of them. Everything else is ignored. Further, one worker is married, another not. One has more children than another, and so forth. Thus, with the equal performance of labor and hence equal in the compensation fund, one will in fact receive more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid these defects, right instead of being equal would have to be unequal. But these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as when it just emerged after its prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. White can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned therein. So we can only honor rights insofar as we have the ability to do so. In the higher phases of communist society, and now we have the phases of communist society. After the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therefore also its antithesis between mental and physical labor. So there's going to be no antithesis between mental and physical labor, meaning we won't privilege mental labor under physical labor or over it. They'll be seen as equal. And thus the difference has vanished after labor has become not only the means of life, but one's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with all-around development of the individual, you will notice that people often will quote this, but only talk about one side of these equations. And all springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society be inscribed on its banners from each according to his ability to each according to his ability to each according his need. Now that's not Marx's phrase, by the way. This phrase may even be from the Bible. You know, it's an old phrase. It seems to have originated from August Becker in 1844, describing it as the basic principle of communism. Louis Blanc used it in 1851, as did the but it seems like the socialist Saint-Simonists used it even before that. It definitely was part of the Guilford Covenant, which was a covenant signed by a relatively communistic form of English settlers in Quinnipiac. And some people think you can even take this back to the Acts of the Apostles and Christian teaching. Right? That's what happens in the church. So Marx is saying that's the goal, but we're not going to have that in the early stages of communist society. Like, we need to get rid of capitalism before we get to that point. I think this, this is also where people use like, well, state-run capitalism is still a good thing because it does this. Although Marx says pretty clearly that that the labor tokens are standardized. There's no market price fluctuation. He's pretty clear about that in this. All right. So that seems to be a problem for both we have to have total rational planning everywhere school of communism in the early phases, and a problem for we can have markets pretty much like we have under capitalism, but they're just controlled by the state for the common good. Both of these seem to be cut against here, but it also isn't like everyone just gets the same amount of stuff. That isn't what's said here at all. All right, back to the text. I have dealt more with it linked with the undiminished proceeds of labor on one hand and with equal right and fair distribution on the other. This is why when Daniel B. What is Politics says, Marx critique of egalitarianism was a critique of a liberal egalitarianism. He actually just says that power egalitarianism is what everyone means by it. I actually think that's not true. That a lot of people do mean absolute equality by egalitarianism, but power egalitarianism makes sense that we'd all have equal recourse to the means of our own life because we're in a classless society, so we are all technically equal. Right? We might have unequal outcomes because some of us work harder or whatever. But Marx is trying to imagine a society that is truly meritocratic in that you just get the labor you put into it. Not even the quality of your labor, that the labor and the intensity you put into it is what you're going to get out. On the other hand, in order to show what a crime it is to attempt, on one hand, to force our party, and this, but yes, he means the Eisenknockers, again, as dogmas, ideas in which certain period have some meaning but now have become obsolete verbal rubbish, while again perverting on the other the realistic outlook, which costs so much effort to instill into the party, but which now is not, but which is now taking root in it, by means of ideological nonsense about right and other trash so common amongst Democrats and French socialists. Ouch. So what he's saying here is pretty clear, right? Like, we've tried to keep the party from promising things we can't possibly deliver by, over promising and being vague and all this without dropping the goal of, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. All right. Now we can talk about the fact that it's all phrase mail. You can talk about a lot of stuff in this, but I don't think this is a perfect document. But that's beyond the point. This actually really clarifies that a lot of people, both critics of Marx and Marxists, don't seem to understand what he's saying here. Now, there are interpretive traditions that change the meaning of these texts, and we're going to have to talk about that later. Because the bourgeois right is often taken, well, there is still capitalism in the early phases of communist society. And it's not just because we're doing like for like exchanges, which is what Marx is calling bourgeois. It's because like we still have to have some kind of capital formation to have like a price signal or whatever. But Marx doesn't talk about that at all, and he would definitely have said it more explicitly if that's what he meant. At least I think so. Next part. Quite apart from the analysis so far given, it is a general mistake to make a fuss about the distribution and put principal stress on it. Now, this is interesting because the distribution of goods is what most people think of communism being about. And what Marx is saying, we got to talk about this because we got to talk about it, but it's not even the most important thing. The most important thing is that we're all equal in control over the productive of labor, and we're all compensated the same amount per hour for our work, or however it's measured, but he says hour. And we're compensated, and we still have choice over the goods we get and whatnot. We're like, we can still become materially more wealthy in that we have more things that we have use values for, but this is aimed on getting rid of abstract value altogether. That's a pretty big difference from contemporary society. Any distribution, whatever, of the means of consumption is only the consequence of the distribution of the conditions of the production themselves. That's a pretty big statement. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers in the forms of property in capital and land, while the masses are the only owners of the personal conditions of the production of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of productions are cooperatively property of the workers themselves, then they are likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism, and from in it turn a section of Democrats, this is petit bourgeois liberal Democrats here, have taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of the distribution as an independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution, after the real relations have long been made clear. Why retrogress again? Now, this is interesting because this is still true. What Marx is saying here is, like, you're going to have an unequal society as long as it's structured with rights that are divided like this and access that's divided like this. You can redistribute the cash as much as you want, but as long as this happens, it's going to resort this way. How it resorts this way may look all kinds of ways, but don't lie by saying just because you redistribute the nominal wealth, right, or the value to make it more equal, but there's still an unequal decision-making process and unequal access to land and to capital, that you're going to have an unequal society no matter what you do. So quit thinking that you can ameliorate it just by throwing cash at people. Now, that's going to hurt a lot of liberals and heterodox economists' souls. All right. Subsection 4. Another statement. The emancipation of labor must be the work of the working class, relative to which all other classes are only the reactionary masses. Only reactionary masses. Ooh, yeah, this is going to piss Marx off, believe it or not. The first strophe is taken from the introductory words of the Rules of the International, but improved. There it said, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. Here, on the contrary, the working class has to emancipate what? Labor? Let him understand who can. In compensation, the antistrophe, on the other hand, is a Lassallean quotation of the first water, relative to which the working class, all other classes are reactionary mass. In the Communist Manifesto, it said, of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeois today, the proletariat alone is really the revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of the modern industry. The proletariat is special and is its special and essential product. The bourgeoisie here is conceived as a revolutionary class, as the bearer of large-scale industry relative to the feudal lords and the lower middle class, who desire to maintain all social positions that are the creation of obsolete modes of production. Thus, they do not form together with the bourgeoisie only one reactionary mass. On the other hand, the proletariat is revolutionary relative to the bourgeoisie because, having itself grown up on the basis of large-scale industry, it strives to strip off from production the capitalist character that the bourgeoisie seeks to perpetuate. But the manifesto adds that the lower middle class is becoming revolutionary in the view of its impending transfer to the proletariat. By the way, for people who miss this, who think the PMC are automatically reactionary, if you think that's a class, the lower middle class is becoming revolutionary in view of its impending transfer to the proletariat, meaning as they become poorer, the petite bourgeoisie, the professionals, the intellectual, etc., all these middle strata classes are in a more precarious position and have more reason to fight with the workers. Now, complication to this is the lumpinization thesis, but that's not in this text. From this point of view, therefore, it is again nonsense to say that together with the bourgeoisie and with the feudal lords into the bargain, form only one reactionary mass relative to the workers. Yeah, not everybody who's not a worker is reactionary, people. Marx is really clear about this too. Has one proclaimed to the artisan, the small manufacturer, etc., and the peasants during the last election, relevant to us, you, together with the bourgeoisie and the feudal lords, form one reactionary mass? Or all the people who aren't workers, but who are oppressed, are part of the reactionary mass too, just because they aren't because they aren't workers? Lassalle knew the Communist Manifesto by heart. Yeah, Lassalle claimed to be a Marxist, by the way, before Marx basically kicked him out. As his faithful followers know the gospel written by him. If, therefore, he has falsified it so grossly, this has occurred only to put good color on his alliance with the absolutist and feudal opponents against the bourgeoisie. Meaning that he's willing to join up with people who are anti-bourgeois solely because they're anti-bourgeois, not because they're actually for the workers or for the betterment of society. He's willing to forgive landowners, landholders, warlords, and whatever to make his alliance. You know, basically Marx is saying that Lassalle is the first Red Browner. And Lassalle does have relationships to like the German historical school, which is very much the people that Marx mocked as armchair socialists and whatever early on. In the above paragraph, moreover, his ocular saying is dragged in the main force without any connection to the botched quotation from Rule of the International. Thus, it is simply an impertinent and indeed not at all displeasing to Herr Bismarck, one of those cheap pieces of insolence for which Marat of Berlin deals. Marat of Berlin is a reference to Hassen, the chief editor of the Newer Social Democrat. Right, subsection 5. The working class strives for its emancipation, first of all, within the framework of the present-day national states. Conscious that the necessary result of its effort, which are common to the workers of civilized countries, will be the International Brotherhood of Peoples. Lassalle, in opposition to the Communist Manifesto and to all other socialism, conceived the workers' movement from the narrowest national standpoint. I want you guys to hear that because national standpoints is super fucking common today. He is followed in this and that after the work of the International. It is altogether self-evident that to be able to fight at all, the working class must organize itself at home as a class, and that its own country is the immediate arena of its struggle, insofar as its class struggle is national, not in substance, but as the Communist Manifesto says, in form. But The framework of the present-day national state, for instance, the German Empire, is itself in turn economically within the framework of the world market, politically within the framework of the system of states. Every businessman knows that the German trade is at the same time foreign trade, and that the greatness of Herr Bismarck consists, to be sure, precisely in his pursuing that kind of international policy. And what does the German Workers' Party reduce its internationalism to? The consciousness that the result of its effort will be the International Brotherhood of Peoples, a phrase borrowed from the Bourgeois League of Peace. The Bourgeois League of Peace was a pacifist organization of Switzerland in 1867. It asserted that a united Europe, or a United States of Europe, could prevent wars. It's actually kind of the beginnings of, I don't know, the EU. Anyway, which is intended to pass as the equivalent to an international brotherhood of the working classes and joint struggle against the ruling class and their governments. Not a word, therefore, about the international functions of the German working class. And it is to challenge its own bourgeoisie, which is already linked up in a brotherhood against it with the bourgeoisie of all other countries, and Herr Bismarck's international policy of conspiracy. In fact, the internationalism of the program stands even infinitely below that of the Free Trade Party. The latter also asserts that the result of its effort would be the International Brotherhood of Peoples. Basically, like, you're not even trying to do what the quote globalists want to do in modern parlance. But it also does something to make international trade, and by no means contents itself with the consciousness that all people are carrying on trade at home. And Marx is real mad. He's like, the international bourgeoisie actually does something. We're just going to work at home and then we'll deal with internationalism later. It doesn't do anything. And if you're a socialist and you hear that, I want you to think about that real hard. The international activity of the working class does not in any way depend on the existence of the International Working Men's Association. This was only the first attempt to create a central organ for the activity. An attempt which was lasting success on the account of the impulse which it gave, but which was no longer realizable in its historical form after the fall of the Paris Commune in 1871. Bismarck's Norddeutsche was absolutely right when it announced, to the satisfaction of its master, that the German Workers' Party have sawn off internationalism in their new program. So many people construe this text to say opposite of what it does. Like, it doesn't say that we can abolish national organization at first, because we exist in nations and capitalism exists in nations, but capital exists as an international cooperation and in an international world system. And pretending that your nation is not in that because of chartalism or the ability to print currency or whatever is not just foolish, it's fundamentally wrong. And if you don't see that, well, you're rejecting a fundamental premise of Marxism. Now, I know a lot of people go, but Marx didn't publish this, and that's true, he didn't. But there's stuff that echoes all of this, but not stated this clearly in the other economic manuscripts, which he also didn't publish, admittedly, but he intended to eventually. He also had a lot of the language changed in the Gotha program before it was adopted, and it's quite clear he wasn't happy with the consolidation, but he was happy enough to stay in the party, whereas prior to this, he was even threatening to leave, or stay as the international representation of the party. And prior to this, he was threatening to leave. All right. We're going to stop here because we finished section 1. We'll come back to section 2 and another nail it down. I hope you guys learned a lot today. It's real good to read this one word by word close, because Marx is doing a lot of things in here, and you can easily read it sloppily and misinterpret it, or you can fix it by adding new hermeneutics that say this thing means stuff that if you don't read it very carefully, you won't realize that it doesn't mean that. Like, oh, we're going to maintain markets and lower state socialism. That's not what this is saying. Like it's saying we're going to maintain like for like exchange and labor hours. I like to thank my patrons, including my new Kano Kohanan patrons, for enabling us to do this. The most recent two are Golden and Jim D. Thank you so much for your support. And hopefully in the near future, we will be doing more of my patrons only shows, which these people have a hand in producing, meaning they can have me do stuff for interviews for patrons only. They can be interviewed themselves as they want, etc. It only goes out to the patron group, but I like talking to anybody. And on that note, you get one of those a year as a kind of Kohanan. We're gonna end this episode of Nailing It Down, and we'll be back to talk about the key to the Gotha program very soon.